And we now turn the presentation over to Becky.
Yep, thanks Becky for coming back and
Or Fern.
working with us through enhancing natural supports. Take it away.
Awesome, thanks so much. Thank you everybody for coming today. I'm really happy to physically see some of your faces and to see some of you returning. So like Fern had said, we're going to talk about how to enhance natural supports and navigate complex systems for adolescents with disabilities. So again, for those folks who don't know, I do work at the Calgary Sexual Health Center, and we have a wide variety of programs aimed to support the sexual health rights and sexual health needs of people across the lifespan. And one of the programs that we offer is a program specifically for folks with developmental disabilities and disabilities in general. And so the information that I'm bringing forward today really does come from our 20 years of work with this community, and also from some of the other work that we've done in terms of enhancing natural supports. So I think we'll have a really interesting discussion today. And of course, if you have any questions for me or you'd like more information about any of the resources, please feel free to reach out. You can also look at our website at www.calgarysexualhealth.ca. So our goal for today is to really look at specific strategies that you can use to help parents and guardians really understand the relationship needs of the adolescents in their lives, how to ensure that these adolescents are getting sexual health information, and helping the guardians help the adolescents make informed choices about consent in relationships. And we're also going to consider some advocacy strategies, and we'll look at action plans to promote the relationship rights of adolescents with disabilities. So for today, we have the same rights that we would for any other session around participation. And so I really hope that you all feel compelled to participate. You're the experts in your state and in your jobs. Please let me know what you think. What are some of the challenges that you're having? What are some things that are working really well? And so you can participate in a bunch of different ways today. You can unmute your line and just ask a question. You can do that at any point. You can also use the chat box below just to type in a question or to respond. I'm going to be asking a lot of open questions, and so please feel free to type in your comments there. And also I might be asking some questions where you can then raise your hand and do things like that to agree or disagree with some statements. You also have the right to pass, and so if you just want to sit back and relax and take this webinar in, that's entirely fine. We all have the right to respect, and you're all respectful adults. I know you know this. But I do want to touch on the fact that we do all have different values about what it means to work with families, what it means to talk about sexuality, what it means for folks with disabilities to have to negotiate with families about their sexual health. And so just in order for us to feel really safe and comfortable, that's the fax machine. I am not in my own office, I'm sorry, just ignore that. Around our different values, I just ask that we're open and curious as to why we might feel the way that we feel. All folks have the right to privacy, and so if you do want to talk about a situation with a family or a client, just make sure that you are really cautious about how you describe the situation, that you're very considerate of their own privacy rights. As you know, this is being recorded and folks will be able to access this, so do make sure that you protect the rights of the families and the clients that you work with for privacy. And the last one is I hope we have an enjoyable time together this afternoon. In my work with all of you folks, it's always been quite fun, and you have lots of really great things to share, so I want to continue on that vein. All right, so we've seen this little diagram quite consistently in all of our sessions, and I want to come back to it today because I think what we've learned through working with guardians and parents is sometimes when we tell them that we're going to be talking to the adolescents in their life about sexuality, they assume that we're actually going to just teach them about sex. And as sexual health educators, we know that's not true. When we're teaching folks about sexuality, what are some of the things that we're looking at teaching? So I'm just going to give you a moment to type in your responses around when we teach about sexuality, what are we actually teaching? So we're talking about adolescent development, puberty, sexual response, safer behaviors, values, consent, and also healthy relationships, absolutely. And so our first role in working with guardians and with caregivers is to really help them understand that when we talk about sexual health, we're actually talking about so much more. And so we go back to this diagram, and you can even use this if you want with parents, to talk about our sexuality is so much more than just sex. It's about our spirituality, our values, our culture, our religion. It's about our feelings about self and others. It's about our physical health and our reproductive anatomy for sure, but it's also about our thoughts, our beliefs, and what we know. And so when we talk to folks about sexuality, we're actually giving them strategies to make healthy choices in the future. And we're really providing them with the information that they need to be autonomous adults in the future. So it can be helpful if we really help guardians understand what we're talking about and what sexuality education is actually, what it actually encompasses. So another big open question to everybody, when we think about natural supports, who are they? So I want you to just type in the different names or different people that are natural supports in folks' lives. And I'll just give you a minute to do that. So family, great. Who else? So we said somebody said counselors. We'll come back to that. Friends, peers, somebody else said teachers. We'll come back to that. Family members, friends, faith supports, absolutely. Community members like religious leaders, for sure. Okay. So we had lots of different ideas that really match some of the ideas that came up here. So family, parents, chosen family, friends, partners, community supports, so religious leaders, people from your church, possibly coworkers. Counselors, teachers, those folks wouldn't be considered natural supports. Natural supports basically are anyone who isn't paid to be in that adolescent's life. So why do you think it's important that we really focus on working with natural supports? Any ideas? And you can go ahead and unmute your line if you're comfortable with doing so, or you can just type in a response.
Hi, Becky. I just wanted to verbally chime in instead of type all the time, but I'm kind of thinking that maybe they're part of your community, they're part of your everyday life, rather than having to make an appointment and go see someone or have to count on squeezing in it around a school schedule. You know, it's people that you see on an everyday basis. Perhaps?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great answer, and that's absolutely true. So what I think research has really shown us, and in Calgary, the United Way has done about 5 years of developmental evaluation focusing on enhancing natural supports for youth. And I think the big part of this is that, Megan just said it, there's potential lifelong supports or long-term supports. So we actually can't guarantee that professional services are always going to exist for people. And also, I remember when I was in school, which was quite some time ago now, one of the things that we often said is in social services and social work, we're actually working ourselves out of a job. And so I think the recognition that natural supports are so vital to people because they are, for the most part, going to be there 24 hours a day, long term, and that we really have to avoid building an over-reliance on social systems, which we have definitely done, particularly for folks with disabilities. I think that the idea of a network of support being overly professional is something that we've seen time and time again. But really, like Megan said, these are the folks who, could potentially be there for the long term. And so they are probably the most important people for us to be working with. Also, if we think about adolescents with disabilities, their natural supports can either help them have healthy relationships, achieve authentic sexuality, or in some cases it could actually be a barrier to access. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit more and see how we can help mitigate that as professionals. All right. So I did mention the developmental evaluation that United Way here in Calgary took on, and what they did is they came up with a lens, which I think is a really important kind of piece to look at. So when we're working with adolescents, when we're working with their guardians, one of the things we have to do is actually treat the connection first. So the connection to the natural support is as important as basic needs. We need to see that as much of our intervention plan as it is anything else. And so when we're talking to adolescents as coordinators, if you're talking to someone about healthy relationships or consent, it's about always tying it back into the natural supports in their lives. So, have you talked to your parents about this? What do you think their values are? Adolescents don't need to agree with their parents' values or their natural supports values, but it is really good to foster those conversations. Another important principle here is that we seek out and scooch over. And so we actively seek out natural supports, and then we actually make space for them to contribute. Oftentimes when we see adolescents with disabilities in our counseling program, we really encourage those natural supports to be part of the conversation and be part of the counseling session for a couple of reasons. What we've really learned is that natural supports, if they understand why we need to provide this information, they can really become a strong ally and advocate for the youth. They can also repeat the same information that professionals give consistently. And for many adolescents, particularly with developmental disabilities, repetition is a really important part of learning. And so by having our natural supports on board to keep that teaching and to keep that conversation going, our education and information is just so much more successful. Doing with and not for, and I think this is really important. We're doing work with the adolescents and the young people, but we're never working harder than them. And so it's about helping them recognize what some community supports might be, letting them know different ways that they can access those things, but also letting things happen at the pace that they're comfortable with. The number one question I get from adults with disabilities is actually, how do I meet someone? How do I find a date? And I think that's a really important thing for us as professionals not to lose sight of. Oftentimes it is that human connection that folks are looking for. The next principle is social emotional learning. So we support youth to build and maintain meaningful relationships. A situation that we've had is, an adolescent is interested in dating, and perhaps the guardian doesn't want that to happen. So the adolescent has come to us and said, my parents don't want me to date, I don't know what to do, I think I'm just going to do it and not tell them. And so things that we sometimes do is help act as a mediator with the guardian to come together and really have a conversation about what dating looks like, to clarify perhaps what that youth's expectation is of dating, to help parents really understand that for this adolescent to be dating in secrecy, that's really much more dangerous than having an open and trusting conversation. So we can be mediators in situations. And then also a harm reduction approach to relationships, so cultivating a more realistic approach to risk management and safety. This one I think is a really interesting one. We might have an adolescent who tells us that they have a really great friend who is their natural support, and they might sometimes tell us different things about this friend that we would be like, that doesn't seem totally healthy. I think conventionally we oftentimes try to protect youth. And one of the challenges that can come out of that is that we might put judgment on this relationship. And so helping that youth maybe perhaps understand some of the things that we're seeing, but also still supporting that as a valid natural support for that adolescent. So I just want to talk a little bit about parents and guardians. When we think about adolescents with disabilities, what are some of the concerns or fears that parents or guardians might have around sexuality? So you can just use the the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share. So we have a participant that said pregnancy, yeah, for sure. STIs, sexual abuse or coercion, absolutely. I think most of the guardians that we've worked with, that's been their number one fear. What's, I think, important to notice about that is that while folks with disabilities are at a much increased rate to experience sexual violence than folks without disabilities, one of the number one protective factors is actually information and education, and so it's very important for guardians to understand that. Someone else wrote, the ability to understand sexually and engage in healthy behaviors. So that is absolutely true. I've had tons of guardians tell me, I'm really not sure that they actually get it, and can they really consent to this behavior? All fair, right? I think one of the important pieces of working with natural supports is separating our own professional values from the conversation. So certainly I've worked with guardians where I felt like maybe that's quite restrictive, or denying the adolescent in your life this information is a huge problem. But I also need to separate that and recognize that oftentimes it's because guardians are coming at this from a place of concern. And so trying to work with that and to understand that. That being said, though, all of the things that you listed, what is the impact of these concerns on the adolescents? So what happens sometimes with families? So self-doubt, absolutely. What else? Disconnection, for sure. The youth does not learn self-trust because they do not feel trusted. Yeah, I would say that that's absolutely true. If a person receives a message that they actually can't make decisions, that might be something that they internalize. And Megan, this is the most important piece in my mind, youth actually don't get the information that they need, so they're denied sexual health education. And that is actually putting them at more risk for pregnancy, for sexual violence, for the, inability to understand what they're consenting to. And so for me, that's what the bottom line always is helping parents recognize that this information is not only a human right for the adolescents in their lives, but also crucial for them and would mitigate some of their fears. I kind of touched on this a little bit, but what are some of the values that we can have sometimes about working with natural supports? As professionals, what are some of the things that we might believe about them? I feel like they don't want their children to get this information, and that could be frustrating, honestly, for us. I know that that's been a source of frustration for me in the past, for sure. We might believe that they're going to be hostile to us, and that's real. I've certainly thought about that as well, and I think it's important that we spend some time thinking about these things and checking in about our own assumptions so that we're able to, start our work with guardians and with parents from a clean slate. And, recognize it's interesting that we might think that they're going to be hostile. Sometimes when we assume that, we see that behavior regardless of if it's happening or not. Fern also says that they may not be open to learning new information from us, and I think that's definitely an assumption that I've personally had. Obviously, what we have to do is really hone in on what some of these assumptions or values might be so that we can separate them and we can treat each parent and each guardian as its own kind of unique family unit with their own unique concerns, thoughts, and ideas. And that way we're able to be really open about the kind of information and interventions we're proposing with them. So I borrowed quite a bit from Caitlin Ryan's work, who is an American researcher that does work around enhancing natural supports with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth. And I think that her theories and research are incredibly useful when we actually look at this population as well. So I'm just going to read this quote to you because I think it's just really good. and we're going to chat a little bit about this information. So the overall objective in helping families learn to support their LGBT children is not to change their values or deeply held beliefs. Instead, practitioners should aim to meet parents, families, and caregivers where they are, to build an alliance to support their LGBT children and to help them understand that family reactions that are experienced as rejection by their LGBT child contribute to serious health concerns and inhibit their child's development and well-being. So what I also think is really helpful is this idea of a strengths-based approach. We want to really tap in with, well, what are some of your family's values? And how do we use those values or deeply held beliefs to support the adolescent in your life? So how do you think this research would translate into working with parents of adolescents with disabilities? What are some thoughts that you might have? How is this similar? Maybe how is it different? So Megan says, it's a more positive approach to bring them to the table and addressing their concerns and finding a common ground. Absolutely, right? It's about sitting down with that family and really checking in with understanding how come they're worried about certain things, kind of, I think, negotiating some of the concerns that the adolescent has with what the parents have, and it really is about finding common ground. What I love about this is that it really does talk about using people's belief systems as strengths, right? And helping parents understand what can happen if we aren't supporting adolescents. Shelby says, recognize that they care about their child and let the adolescent know this. I think that's also really important as well. We never want to cause conflict in a natural support. Right? These are the supports that are absolutely necessary for folks, particularly for some folks with disabilities who will have stronger connections with natural supports as they age than folks without disabilities might have. Not in all cases, but sometimes. And so we do want to make sure that this relationship is preserved as much as possible. So it is about building rapport, creating an alliance, and helping the adolescents and the guardians really communicate in open, conflict-free ways as much as possible. So what are some of the things that you can do? So there is some things that are already up here, but what are some of the ideas that you have that you could do to help support adolescents with their natural support? So I'm going to give you a couple moments just to type in some stuff, and then we'll go over what's on the screen as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things on here. So this is great. So practice communication skills or scenarios with them. That's huge. If you have an adolescent come to you and tell you something, and even if you're, perhaps a very, very, very busy coordinator, you can say, hey, could we schedule some time to chat about this? And then when the adolescent comes in, you could do that, role play, give them some language to talk about the concerns with their parents, and really, I think, help them have these conversations. The other thing that you can do is meet directly with the parents, and I love, Megan, that you brought this up. Give the parents the tools so that they can then be the champions, so that they can be the ones giving this information to the adolescents in their life. So some of the things that we suggest is working with the families from a strengths-based approach, really helping them understand what we're teaching them in sexual health education to help them get on board. We host family nights for parents and guardians right at schools and allow folks to come together and really ask the questions that they're having. Oftentimes, guardians and parents are really worried about things like social media, sexting, how to have conversations about these things with the adolescents, how to promote consent and healthy relationships, all of these issues. And so you can host different theme nights around these things. Again, it's really important to talk about this information as a means of violence prevention. That, I think, is really key. Most of the times when guardians are concerned, it's because they're worried about the adolescent. Again, act as a translator, really help the adolescents and the parents understand what each person is saying. Talk about the importance of open communication and trust, And definitely listen to both parties. It's really important that you're aware of what your own attitudes, values, and beliefs are about this. It is hard, right? As all human beings in the world, are sexual beings, we are all going to come to this with our own experiences. And so it's super important to separate our own thoughts and values from that of the client, of the family, etc. So Fern asked a question, do you have a particular hook to get care providers to attend family nights? I asked because I've worked with those who host school information education events and attendance is low. Great question, absolutely true. So what we typically do is we focus it around a specific need that's come up in a school. Typically, guardians are really interested in, like I said, talking about social media and sexting. That has been a better draw. We sometimes do it during parent-teacher interview nights when parents are more likely to already be there. With younger folks, we offer childcare. And another piece that I think is really interesting is some organizations are starting to do this through a webinar, which is probably a lot easier for busy parents to be able to commit to half an hour online on a Tuesday night at 8:30 than it is to have folks coming right after work. So I would say be really creative about the different approaches. We have also had higher incidence of uptake in some circumstances than others. It is really difficult to get families involved for sure. All right. I'm curious if anybody has any kind of specific questions or case examples that they would want to talk about before we move into the advocacy piece. Okay. So we run into issues with the special education teachers who do not want their students to attend the Health Resource Center. Sometimes they will let us come present, but with this population, we generally prefer one-on-one counseling to tailor to their developmental needs. Do you have any suggestions for this? Okay, so that's an excellent, amazing question. I have a couple of thoughts. So I think that what could be really interesting is hosting a bit of a session for teachers to help them understand what some of the questions are that their students might be having. Even just to do an hour conversation around understanding the values that we might personally have about folks such as adolescents with disabilities being sexual beings and debunk some of that. We might also want to set up a bit of a conversation with those teachers to help them understand why you want to do the one-on-one more so as opposed to the group counseling. That being said, what we tend to do is we'll go in and we'll do our comprehensive sexual health education program that's designed specifically for folks with disabilities. And so that means, we do a lot more sessions with that group. We implement a variety of teaching and learning tools that are specifically geared to folks. But then we make sure that we talk a lot during those sessions about our one-on-one counseling supports. So through the group sessions, you can do a little bit of recruitment. We also do anonymous question box in those classes. And I mean, it's sometimes less anonymous because we're helping people write, et cetera. But what's good about that is that the teachers sometimes then get an idea about what some of the issues actually are. And so I think we've gotten folks, teachers in particular, to understand the importance of sending people over to us for more one-on-one work based on the complexity of some of the questions. And I think it helped them really understand what the needs were. So I kind of am offering you a couple approaches, a little bit of professional development for those teachers to help them clarify their own values. Trying to really continue to do those group sessions. And this is a really great thing too, maybe allowing the teachers to ask questions through the anonymous question box as well. Sometimes I think teachers are asking on behalf of the students, but we actually all really have questions about sexuality. I've been a sexuality educator for 16 years and I still have questions. So I think that is a really great way to approach that. And thank you so much, Megan. I think that's a really common scenario for many of us. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about advocacy and navigating those complex systems such as schools. So how do we appropriately act as allies with the students that we work with and really advocate for them within some very large, complex systems? So one of the things that I think is really important to hone in on is sexual and reproductive rights. And so all of our education is actually based on the sexual and reproductive rights of individuals. And really, those things are quite clear. Every person has the right to information and education, privacy, to choose whether or not to marry, date, or have partners, to decide whether or when to have children, access to health care and health protection, and that includes choosing when to be on birth control, choosing what type of birth control, if that's something they need, condoms, access to internal and external condoms, and to be free from ill treatment. And that's from partners, but that's also from systems, right? And I think that it's really important that we share this information with people as much as possible, because we do know that unfortunately adolescents with disabilities in particular oftentimes don't have their sexual health rights respected by larger systems, by guardians, by support workers, and we can see that historically that this is something that has existed for a very long period of time. So when we're doing advocacy, I think there's a couple of things that are really important. You know, it starts with a bit of a recognition. So understanding, which I think every single human being here does, that folks with disabilities might be seen as either asexual or hypersexual, that sometimes in the guise of protecting people, we may actually create very restrictive policies for folks. So understanding that this is happening and then helping communities communicate these unmet needs into larger systems area. So, you know, building that support for taking action. So when we think about advocacy, there's one part that I never want to leave out, and it's the most important thing. So I'm curious, what do you think the first step in good advocacy involves? So I'm going to let you all take the time to answer that question. What's the most important thing with good advocacy? Active listening. Yes, that is very, very, very excellent. A welcoming environment for everyone, community practices and introduction. Excellent. Talking points on a literacy level that are appropriate. Great. So these are all super important things. I'm going to start with active listening because that actually is the most important piece with advocacy. It's one thing to recognize that an individual or group is experiencing oppression. As an ally in particular, or someone with more power, which would be, you know, anybody who's in a professional role, is to directly work with those students and actively listen to what their needs are. We should never move forward on advocating on behalf of someone without their explicit consent or permission. And so I think active listening is a really great place to start so that we can really understand what is it that person wants and what are they willing to let you share and move forward on. I think that there's sometimes we'll learn about individual circumstances, and we need to be really careful that we don't advocate on behalf of a client who's not ready and who's not there yet. That being said, though, I think there are lots of times where, you know, let's say in a particular school environment, as a coordinator, you learn that certain students are being told they don't need sexual health education. I think that if you have an entire group of students being denied their right to information, then you really can take that up as a piece of advocacy. And that's where you start with the welcoming environment for everyone, community presence, you start to get to know the people in the school, you talk to the administrators, you build trust and you build rapport in order to reach that ultimate goal of ensuring that folks are getting the information that they actually need. And I do think it's really important that if you're talking to lots of, really any kind of group around advocacy, that you are using plain language and that you're being really really aware of that. Calgary Sexual Health Center has worked with a group called Right to Love for the last, well, probably nearly 10 years now. I believe they started in 2007. And that's a group of self-advocates, so folks with disabilities, who come together monthly to advocate for their right to love. There's really great videos online that they've made talking about the importance of healthy sexuality, the ability to make decisions, the right to get married, the right to have relationships for folks with disabilities. And what I think is really great about this is that the entire group is actually run by the self-advocates. The self-advocates have come up with their rules of engagement. They're the ones who choose the activities, the advocacy work that they do. It is really led by them, and we're just there kind of as in case somebody wants to ask some specific questions about sexual health. We also offer our space, so we, as allies, try to use some of our own power and privilege to really, open doors so that other folks can walk through them. And I think that's a really important piece, is that we're not working on behalf of someone, we're really working beside and oftentimes behind folks. So those are really a really interesting example is Right to Love, and I would encourage folks to look that up and kind of see some of the work that they've done. So again, good advocacy is really about knowledge and empowerment. So sometimes it might be about helping folks who maybe conventionally have not had the same rights as other people. Information, they definitely know that their rights haven't been respected, but give them some information around, how to advocate and work with them. Having a sense of curiosity, I think, is really important, and understanding the nuances of systems, and also, respect for different communities. And so really working alongside of folks to challenge some things. I think within a school system, this can be really interesting. And there is lots of advocacy that youth can take on. And I think it's about, just being there perhaps as a trusted adult to help facilitate some of these discussions with school admin, et cetera. Does anybody have any examples of advocacy you've seen that have worked really well, or any kind of specific questions around this piece? Yeah, so I think this is a really great statement. It helped in the past to bring in the school nurse as another advocate to provide these services to students, and I think that's really great. As much as possible, if you can find other allies within the system, especially if you're working within larger systems like that, having more professionals involved can be extremely helpful. Oftentimes, and this is kind of interesting, our biggest advocates are actually the parents and the guardians. So if you can get the parents and the guardians on board about something, particularly if it is sexual health education, we've been brought into schools because parents and guardians for the students who do have disabilities have said, hey, it's really weird that our students aren't receiving the sexual health education that they should be as mandated by the government, and we want this to happen. So sometimes it can be a very small group of dedicated parents that can enact a lot of change. Guidance counselors are definitely another excellent group to work with in this area for sure. And sometimes, I think good advocacy is again not dissimilar to working with natural supports. You might have an individual at the school who has some very strong values about what would be appropriate or inappropriate behavior for adolescents to be engaging in with each other. Maybe they're a professional that's saying, no, they shouldn't be dating at all, we need to tell the parents, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's about, again, the same way we would work with a natural support is trying to understand where they're coming from, trying to build rapport with them and understand what kind of values are there. And then from a really kind of soft place, helping them recognize the impact that has for the student if we're prohibiting some students from, say, holding hands or cuddling and other students from not. So it is really, again, starting from a place that's open and curious. Maybe working with teachers or other allied professionals in the schools to become more comfortable with working with parents and caregivers. Sometimes they get marginalized as non-experts, oddly enough. And I think that that's a really good point, too, is helping other folks working with natural supports, I think, is huge. I've sometimes heard people be a little bit worried about parent pushback. And so sometimes we might avoid those conversations with parents, but I do think that they are actually the experts in their kids' lives. And so it is really important, I think, to be really honing in on those folks, those natural supports. as part of advocacy, but also, as part of working with adolescents in general. Okay. So does anybody have any questions or comments for me around advocacy or natural supports, anything like that? I'll give you a moment to think about it. All right. Do you have any suggestions for when we run into situations that may seem as if they've been put on birth control without their knowledge? I think that's a really excellent question and extremely common. So what we oftentimes will do is, in a very plain language way, talk to that person and really try to assess what they understand and what they know, and how they're feeling about being on that form of birth control. So one of the things that we really believe as an agency is that people have the right to make decisions about what medications they take or don't take, and that does include birth control. And so we provide very plain language information about all forms of birth control, and we check in with that person around how they're feeling. I would say that if the person is strongly opposed to being on birth control, if that person is willing and wants to go down this road, you could schedule a meeting with the guardians just to chat about how come. So how come the guardians have decided that this is important? Help the youth articulate maybe why they're uncomfortable with this or why they feel they don't need this, and really try to act as a mediator in that situation. We have had instances where guardians have suggested that people need to be on birth control, and the individuals said, actually, I'm not engaging in any kind of sexual activity with a person who could make me pregnant. And so it was actually about just helping the guardians understand that the adolescent sexual orientation for them was quite well defined. And, I think that sometimes can be an additional layer or challenge. Someone asked the question, for example, a coordinator said based on the menstrual cycle information provided by the student, the coordinator suspects she was given an implant without her knowledge. So I think that's really interesting. I don't know what other people think, but I would suggest, asking the student how she feels about that or how they feel about that, and really, encouraging more dialogue. I would love to say that it's unlikely that someone would have birth control administered without their knowledge, but unfortunately I do know that this is a sexual health right that's violated quite commonly for adolescents and adults with disabilities. And so, I would encourage that coordinator to try to have more conversations and kind of suss it out, and also determine is that an issue for the person? Like, it sounds like maybe they're worried about the fact that perhaps they're not getting a period. So, determining what it is that the individual is really curious about. How do you go about regaining trust once it is lost? And that's another question. I think that's a really, that's a difficult question. And I guess it depends. Usually trust comes back with time. And so sometimes adolescents will lose trust with their guardians will lose trust with the adolescent. And again, it's, kind of just focusing on the importance of a natural support and giving time for those things to rebuild. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking about, though, so if you want to rephrase the question if I didn't answer it, that's okay. Okay, that's what you're asking. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So here are some other resources that you can look up for more information. These are all in your handout. Like I said, I would really love it if you checked out some of the Right to Love videos. They can be found on the Disability Action Hall website, and I do believe that they are in the technical assistance guide that should be available to you. So thank you all so much for your kind attention today and for your questions and for your ongoing learning. It's been really lovely to get to know you and to work with you this afternoon. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you so much for being so knowledgeable and present through this entire series and just giving it your all. It's been a joy to work with you. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.